American and African firms reached more than $15 billion in new commitments and deals at a summit, of course, hosted by President Joe Biden. The U.S. is moving to increase its commercial ties with the continent through investments rather than aid. The commitments cover sustainable energy, health systems, agribusiness, digital connectivity, infrastructure, and more. So with reactions to the just concluded U.S. Africa Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., we have Sanyade Okoli, CEO, Alpha African Advisory, joining us here. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for being with us. Well, how would you assess this summit? What's your take on how everything that concluded there?
So, as you know, it's the first one in 8 years. It's not surprising that that we didn't have a lot going on, certainly the previous president. Somewhat mixed feelings, to be honest. Of course, having investment coming onto the continent is always a good thing. Well, it's usually a good thing if it's deployed well. But my thing is, we've got to bear in mind that they're not doing this simply because they love us.
Right.
But there's several factors at play. There's the geopolitics. Literally, every article you read on this summit makes it very clear that the reason why the US is now courting Africa is essentially they feel like they've lost place to China and to Russia.
Right.
So that's purely geopolitics. But equally, I saw a statistic, I think it was the US Trade Department website, that was saying that for every dollar they spend in the sort of trade development, they get $136 back for US companies.
Wow.
So this is about stimulating their economy as well.
Right.
They recognize that Africa is the fastest growing continent. It's already got over 1 billion people, and it's the fastest growing. And it's a relatively young continent. And as we know, vis-a-vis development, let's just say there are significant opportunities.
Right.
So I think we should approach it with that level of maturity and recognize it for what it is.
All right. Well, what do you make of the digital pledge, $350 million from the U.S.? I think we can lump all this together. Visa announcing $1 billion as well. I guess that ties into the stats you just shared with me.
It all ties into the stats. And some people might also add another level to say there might be a social aspect. Because if you think about it, digital connectivity is connectivity to the, so we used to call it the World Wide Web. And some parts of the world are more dominant in the creation and dissemination of content in the World Wide Web.
Right.
So the more Africans are connected, then the more we are consuming.
What they're sharing.
What they're sharing. The more our cultures and traditions and mindsets are being shaped by people outside of us.
See, this is why we have you on, because you give us the nitty-gritty on these stories beyond the headlines. I want to ask you about, I think Microsoft is also announcing a digital skills program in Kenya. Is that all good as far as more skills coming to the African continent from these big tech corporations?
I think the way I would respond to it is it all altruistic. I don't honestly think so, because equally, the more people who are digitally literate, it creates a demand for their products.
Right. Okay.
And I'm sure there's some good intent there. But we also have to bear in mind that it will benefit them as well.
I want to also ask you about the barriers to entry, if that's a correct term to use for digital skills, a laptop, internet connection. Poor communities, are they left out of that, considering what you need to get to access these skills?
I don't think that it is, the barrier is the technology requirements, because you know that in our parts of the world, you have these what do they call them? Business centers.
Right.
Places with the laptops, etc., that people can go and pay and utilize. I think the bigger barrier is actually the literacy rate, because if somebody cannot read, then they can't actually get onto the websites, they can't go onto the learning platforms. But the onus is on us to ensure that we are raising our literacy rate. And the reality is, the more digitally literate people are, the better it is for them. It enables them to be able to compete for jobs that beforehand, they couldn't. So there's certainly significant benefits that could and should accrue to those who take advantage of what's out there for them.
Yeah. Finally, I mean, you already mentioned this earlier, but you think of Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden, Xi Jinping. Can Africa maintain relations with these warring factions, if you will? Since I know maybe with a beautiful bride, but how do you think we can manage that? Or do we, are we good just staying out of it and just letting them chase us?
I think for a question like that, I think to be able to respond to it appropriately, we need to disaggregate Africa.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, a lot of countries, even when it comes to colonization, they were colonized by different countries.
Right.
Generally, none of those three, certainly. But I don't expect us to act as a herd. I do expect some countries would display greater dexterity in being able to navigate the tensions than others. I think this is a case where you don't utilize a blunt instrument. It requires serious and high-level diplomacy to ensure that you come out of this and it's still a win for you as a country.
Look, we thank you for your time. We always appreciate you coming on to enlighten us on these issues. The CEO of Alpha African Advisory, Sanyade Okoli, thank you so much for joining us.